that. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new room this week. We are reading through the Gammage Cup. If you have not been joining us in the past chapters, we are starting on chapter 12 tonight. If you have not heard any of the previous chapters, they are in a playlist on my YouTube channel for the Gammage Cup, so you can go back and listen to those and get caught up before you come back. So we are reading the Gammage Cup for my sixth grade teacher who passed away in December. This was one of her favorite books. She read it to every class, so I'm reading it in her honor. We are on chapter 12, so we are going to go ahead and jump right. Chapter 12. A turtle should take fright at the sound of a boiling pot. Muggles' maxims. By the next morning, the outlaws had their second wind. Gummy said it was his fourth or fifth. And the walls of the new house grew so high that the builders had to stand on piled up barrels and chests to lay stones. When the last stone was plastered into place, Walter the Earl was so carried away with the accomplishment that he began to dig a storage cellar between the two houses, being, as he pointed out, something of an expert on digging. After their noonday dinner and a short nap, they set off upstream in the boats. "Last time we can all ride at once," Minji pointed out. "After tomorrow, there will only be Gummy's boat, and we can't all squeeze into that." "We'll build a new one," said Muggles confidently. The others groaned in chorus. But soon the little trickle narrowed, and the water became too shallow and fast to take the boats any farther. They had to tie them to trees along the stream's edge and proceed on foot, lugging the heavy picklick baskets with them. "Easier to carry if the picklicks were inside us instead of in the baskets," Gummy suggested. Walter the Earl had left his ash plant behind and brought one of the swords. He had fashioned a sling to carry it at his side, and it swung there at a rakish angle, thrusting out into his gold-embroidered cloak as he strode along. After a while, the trees began to thin out, and the soil became rocky, hurting their feet through their woven slippers. As they got closer to the base of the mountain, the sound of the burbling little trickle was overlaid by the deeper roar and splash of the waterfall tumbling down the side of the cliff, and now they occasionally saw bright glints in the stream bed. Kicking off her slippers, Curly Green waded into the foaming water and retrieved a nugget large as an acorn, which she handed to Minji. "Gold," he said, turning it distastefully this way and that. He raised his arm to hurl it back into the little trickle, but Curly Green stopped him. "It's not but trouble, gold is," Minji protested. "We've finished with money boxes and the like." "But think of what glorious things we can make with it," Curly Green said. "Doorknobs and dishes." "Cloth of gold," added Walter the Earl. "There was something in one of the ancient parchments about making of gold thread. I wonder." He fingered his cloak, which had grown even shabbier in the 4 days that they had been gone from Slipper on the Water. "This is the last of the 3 cloaks which belonged to my family, and it is threadbare. Muggles, do you think you could make gold thread?" "If it's been done before, we can do it again," Muggles said, with more certainty than she felt. How did one spin a thread out of a piece of hard metal? "We'll do it," she repeated, "just as soon as the roof is on the house and Minji has made us a spinning wheel." "You would probably have to melt the gold over a very hot fire. And a kiln," she added. "We've arrived," said Gummy, stopping short. They had just rounded a great rock, and the mountain sloped up behind it, at first gently, and then in a steep ascent to the sheer crags on top. To the left, a slim waterfall cascaded like a long white veil and foamed into the shallow bed of the little trickle. It's, Muggles stammered, straining her neck to see the top. "Are you sure it won't tumble down on us?" "Hasn't yet," answered Gummy. "And see, there are the old gold mine entrances." He pointed to the gaping black openings in the rock-strewn slope. "I've been in 2 or 3 of them, not very far in. It gets lonely when you're all by yourself." They climbed up the nearest opening and ventured inside, into the deepest gloom. That was far enough for Muggles, but Gummy struck a light to a bit of candle that he had brought and plunged ahead into the blackness. Muggles started to back out into the sunshine to let the others pass her if they wanted, but the space was so cramped that she only backed into Walter the Earl. "Go on," he whispered hollowly. "We're following." Muggles hesitated, dreading to be engulfed by that blackness, but the small gleam of Gummy's candle was bobbing farther and farther away, and there seemed nothing to do but follow. Fearfully, Muggles started forward, clutching her cloak around her to keep from brushing against the chill, damp stone of the narrow passage. What slithery creatures might live here, she dared not think, and she started at every scuttering sound, real or imagined. Ahead, the candle stopped its bobbing. She hurried faster to come up with Gummy, but when she reached him with the others close on her echoing heels, he merely grunted and started on again. The tunnel sloped gently downward for a time and then leveled off, but Muggles was hardly conscious of anything as she stumbled along over the uneven floor, save that if she ever got out of this terrible place, she would never, never set foot in it again. Once she looked back at the others, but the feeble light of the candle cast large, wavering shadows on the walls and ceiling behind them, like hulking monsters ready to spring, and she looked back no more. When they had walked until Muggles thought they must surely be almost at the other side of the mountain, Gummy stopped so abruptly that she crashed into him. The candle flew from his fingers and sputtered out on the floor of the passage. "Oh!" gasped Muggles, and the walls mocked her. "Oh! Oh! Oh!" With a muffled exclamation, Gummy dropped to his knees and began scrambling about to find the bit of candle, while the others waited in shivering, black silence. It was terrifying to have your eyes wide open and be able to see nothing. Nothing, just the terrible blackness pressing against your eyeballs. Gummy's searching became more frantic, and then, at last, the echoes picked up his gasp of relief as his fingers closed over the precious bit of wax. In a moment, he had fumbled out his tinderbox and relit the candle. The darkness sprang back. Muggles discovered that she was clutching Walter the Earl's arm. Reluctantly, she let go her hold. "Sorry," Gummy said sheepishly. "I thought I heard something." "Heard something. Heard something," repeated the echoes. They had come to a widening of the tunnel, such as they had passed before, but this one was almost the size of a small room, and indeed, in the flickering candlelight, several rotting old crates at one side looked like 2 chairs and a table. "Cozy," said Curly Green. "We should have brought our baskets with us and had tea here." "Tea here, tea here, tea here," ran the echoes around them until they sounded like titters of giggling imps. "Let's go back," said Muggles with a shudder. "Go back, go back, go back." "Yes," said Walter the Earl, who had poked at the rotting crates only to see them crumble into dust at his feet. "I've had enough, 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 enough," echoed the eerie voices. Gummy passed the candle back to Minji, who was at the end of the procession, and they turned to follow him upward out of the tunnel. But Gummy halted suddenly and clutched at Muggles' arm. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "Hear that? Hear that? Hear that?" They all stood perfectly still until the whispering echo had died away, and then they heard the sound. Tap, 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 tap. Walter the Earl drew his sword from its sling. Tap, 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 tap. It was like 10,000 fingernails tapping on 10,000 tables, or myriads of raindrops beating on a rock wall. It wasn't a comforting sound to hear in an abandoned gold mine in the middle of a mountain with only a candle to light the way. Curly Green gasped. "Look at the sword! The sword! The sword! The sword!" Walter the Earl stared down at the blade and almost dropped it. Where it had been black and ugly before, now it glowed faintly with an inner radiance. "The secret." Walter the Earl scarcely breathed the words. "Secret. Secret, secret," ran the whisper around them and back and forth between the walls. "Listen." Muggles put up a shaking hand. "The tapping has stopped." They strained their ears, but Muggles was right. There was no further sound to be heard. And then they looked back at the sword. The glow was gone, and the blade was black and ugly as before. "Let's get out of here," Minji whispered. "Out of here, out of here. Out of here." The way back seemed endless. They stopped once or twice to listen for the tapping sounds, but they didn't hear them again. Neither did the sword glow again. By the time they emerged from the gloom into the bright sunshine and the comforting sounds of the cascade, they had begun to doubt their eyes and ears. "It was the way the candle shone on the blade," Curly Green said. Gummy nodded. "And the tapping was probably just dripping water. An underground spring or something of the sort." "Whatever it was, I didn't like it," Muggles declared. "It's no wonder many pins gave up mining." Walter the Earl said nothing, but he was frowning thoughtfully up at the rock face of the cliffs towering above them. "Let's eat," said Minji. They spread their picnic on top of the great rock near the mountain. Eating hungrily, they talked little. Each one kept glancing at the mine entrance. Afterward, they searched along the little trickle for more gold nuggets and found enough to fill one of the small baskets. Then the daylight was nearly gone, and they had to hurry along homeward, but not without frequent looks behind them at the misty sunset mountains. "It was only water dripping," Curly Green said after a while. "It was the echo that made us imagine things." "Of course," Muggles agreed. "But if it was water, why didn't it go on dripping?" "Don't be silly," she scolded herself. "What does anybody know about old mines anyway? Maybe they always tap like that." They reached their knoll before it was quite dark. It had been a long day, and they were tired, so after a scanty supper, they quickly snuggled into their comforters under the shelter. But before Muggles went off to sleep, she thought about the way the sword had gleamed in the tunnel. For it had gleamed. She was as sure of that as she was that her name was Muggles. Go ahead and move into Chapter 13. Welcome, Gummy. Welcome, Muggles. Don't tell us about your struggles. Goodbye, Muggles. Goodbye, Gummy. Take back home your empty tummy. Gummy, scribbles, collected works. Soon after sunrise the next morning, Gummy and Muggles set off down the little trickle with the 4 boats in tow. Muggles felt a pang of disloyalty. True, she had to get the rest of her belongings from Reedy, but Gummy could have done it just as well. Her real reason for going was, well, that she just couldn't stay away. She longed to feel the pat-pat of her slippers on cobblestones. With a sigh, she smoothed the folds of her new bright orange cloak, and almost, but not quite, wished that she was still wearing her old green. The glitter stones winked and glimmered as the boat slid from shade into sunlight and back to shade again. "Birds are chirping, fish are slurping," said Gummy dreamily. He paused and then added, "Down the trickle, where the fickle morning breezes come to tease us." "Not very good," he said. "I think my rhyming needs new priming." "Yes," Muggles agreed absently. She twisted around to look at the sunset mountains behind her. They loomed, craggy and cold and lifeless. "The birds are twittering and squirrels chittering as we go flittering down the brook. The dew is glittering, grasshoppers spittering, and trout are frittering in search of a hook." "It's not much better," said Gummy critically. "And it's the wrong season for grasshoppers. Some mornings I just can't get started." He looked over his shoulder at Muggles. "If I were you, I should stop worrying about the mountains, you know. The time to worry is when you know what you're up against, and then there isn't time to worry." He began to whistle. The dock at Slipper on the Water was empty when they landed, but it had been newly repaired and painted. "No WELCUM banners for us," said Gummy. "Ah, well, lend a hand here, Muggles." He started hauling in the string of boats that they had towed, but Muggles didn't lend a hand. She was staring in bewilderment up the street going to the river. "Now, what makes it look so different?" she asked with a frown. "What looks different?" Gummy grunted, tugging at the boats. "Why, it's the trees. The family trees. Oh, Gummy," she wailed. "The family trees are all queer." Gummy hitched the first boat to its post before turning around. Then he stood, thunderstruck at the sight. Up the street, the trees marched in a precise line, one to each house as was the custom, but instead of the haphazard pattern of leafy branches thrusting forth where they would and feathering the houses and street with soft shadows, each tree was a rigid box of leaves set on its trunk, its shade a precise square on the grass. "Well, well," said Gummy at last. How very tidy. How very tidy indeed." "But what have they done?" Gummy shrugged. "Looks like Blaze the Pruner got carried away with a pair of snippers in his hand." He pushed back his peaked hat and rubbed his forehead. "Muggles, I have a feeling that you and I are not going to fit very well into this orderly scheme of things. Perhaps it would be better if we just quietly left now instead of going into the village." "Perhaps," Muggles hesitated, stroking her orange cloak for comfort. "No, I want to see everything just once more. And then there are the things that I left here. Things we will need." "Right." Gummy cheerfully began to pull in the rest of the boats and tie them. They walked up the street going to the river toward the marketplace, but although they saw a few figures crossing the square in the distance, the village had a curiously deserted and subdued air about it. "I wonder where everybody is," said Gummy. "You don't suppose the judges have come and they're having a something for them?" Muggles shook her head. "We would have seen their boat." They were just passing the candlemaker's cottage when Spill himself stepped out onto his doorstone. He looked preoccupied, but when he saw Muggles and Gummy, his face first brightened and then dulled, as though someone had struck a tinderbox to one of his own candles and snuffed it out the next moment. "Greetings," he said cautiously. "What news?" Gummy doffed his hat. "Why, as to that, there's nothing much, except that spring is here to touch." Spring. Spill looked around with an uneasy motion of his skinny neck. "Ah, yes, spring. There's hardly been time to notice, you see. And how is Minji?" "Gay as a cricket," said Muggles. "Sitting on a wicket," she added, with a sidelong glance at Gummy. Spill's face went glum. "Seems I owe him 3 gold pieces. Minji always said it was the money box helping me out, but Bros, he's the new money keeper, says that's impossible, so it looks as though I owe Minji. Not that I've got the gold pieces to pay him with," he finished with a despondent air. "Well, Minji doesn't need the gold, but..." Muggle stopped, transfixed, as an idea occurred to her. "But what?" "But I'll tell him. You've found out what a good friend he has been to you," Muggle said slowly. "I'll tell him that if he is ever in trouble, he can count on you to help him." Yes, you tell him that. Not that it's likely, of course." Spill's scrawny neck angled about. "But I must not keep you." "Oh, you're not keeping us," Gummy said. "We all seem to be going to the marketplace, so we can walk together." "Well, I hardly know," said Spill, hanging back. "Oh, come along," cried Gummy, giving Spill such a hearty slap on the shoulder that the frail candlemaker almost toppled over. Spill came along, his legs moving jerkily, his head tucked down into his neck as far as it would go. The marketplace was as clean and shining as a new gold piece. Each little cottage with its green door and scalloped roof glistened in the sun. Even the cobblestones looked polished. "It's very pretty," Muggle said politely. Gummy pushed back his peaked hat and scratched his head. "I'm not even sure which one used to be my house. It's a bit muddling, not to say fuddling." "Oh, you get used to it, and it's very tidy, of course," Spill assured him. His voice was muffled in his effort to not expose his face to the sight of the several villagers who were glancing curiously in their direction. Bun, the baker's wife, approached with her laden shopping basket, so intent on her footsteps that she didn't see them until Gummy swept off his peaked hat and made her a low bow. "Good morning," he said. With a startled little scream, she stopped so abruptly that a small fish skipped out of the basket and slithered on the cobblestones. "Allow me," said Gummy. He scooped up the fish and presented it to Bun with another low bow, but she only backed off from him, looking wildly around for help. Her eyes fell upon Spill, who was pretending to be all by himself. "You, Spill," she scolded. Have you nothing to do that you stand idly about when everybody else is at work? Or have you become so rich that you can afford to pay a fine to the Council of Periods?" She maneuvered neatly around Gummy's outstretched hand and hurried on, leaving him still holding the fish. I must," mumbled Spill in desperation. I have many things to do. I know you'll forgive me if I..." Of course, Gummy said. "I see how things are with you. Fines for idling, is it?" He took hold of Spill's unresisting hand and slapped the fish into it. "Pray don't linger another moment. Off with you, my good Spill." They watched Spill walk on to supplies, with his head humbly bent and his green cloak flapping about his spare frame. He didn't look as though he could ever be of help to anyone, Muggles thought. Still, you never know. "Fines for idling?" Gummy gave a low whistle. "Think of the gold pieces they must have had from me." "How quiet it is," Muggle said. "Look, there's not a soul in the square but us. Not even a child." Their footsteps slapped loudly in the silence as they crossed the marketplace, past the mayor's house, past Fooley Hall. Gummy suddenly stopped and cocked an ear. Listen. From the open door of Fooley Hall came a stirring and a rustling and a murmuring. Curiously, they tiptoed over and looked in. 100 small mini-pin bodies squirmed on as many stools. 100 worried brows were creased in intense concentration as 100 hands painfully traced out circles and squares and triangles on sheets of rolled birch bark. Geo, the official village painter, strolled around the room, inspecting the grubby work. On the platform, Wim, the official village poet, bided his time by impatiently patting his foot against the leg of his stool. Then Geo began collecting the paintings, and Wim jumped to his feet. Time for poems, he announced, and a soft, wistful sigh whispered about the room. Hush your noise now, or you will all miss your tea again today. You will each write a poem for me on the subject of winning the Gammage Cup. He paused to frown fiercely upon the children. Yesterday, 2 of you used sword in your poems on the subject of playtime. This is the last time I will remind you that there is no such word in the Minipin language. Nor are there any longer folk by the name of Walter the Earl, Curly Green, Mingy, Muggles, or Gummy. You are to forget that such ever existed in our beautiful little village. Anyone heard using any of those names will be required to write 2 extra poems and will miss his tea for a week. They are bad names, wicked names, for they are the names that... But Muggles and Gummy stole away from the door and heard no. All right, chapter 14. Fat sounds, thin sounds, sounds that make you start. Queer sounds, near sounds, sounds that chill the heart. Approaching sounds, encroaching sounds of someone stealing near. Creeping sounds, weeping sounds that make you shake with fear. Gummy, scribbles, collected works. Back at the knoll, Curly Green and Mingy and Walter the Earl had been working furiously from the moment the string of boats pulled away from the dock. Be a good thing to get that roof on the new house, said Mingy when they had walked back up to the knoll. Be a nice surprise for Muggles when they get back. His voice was gruff. There wouldn't be any rare treat for lunch today without Muggles, who made the most ordinary fare rich with herbs and sauces. And while Mingy frequently complained about Gummy's chatter, the prospect of a whole day without it made the hours ahead seem long. Besides, he added, grumbling, this sleeping out under a tree is all very well for wood mice, but when I woke up this morning, a spider was spinning his web from my nose to my ear. Very annoying. Yes, Walter the Earl agreed absently. He had said almost nothing since the incident of the tapping sounds and the glowing sword yesterday. This morning, when the others got up, they had found his comforter neatly folded and Walter the Earl gone. He reappeared, hurrying up the west side of the knoll just before Muggles and Gummy set out, but where he had been, he refused to tell. Just looking around, he said, and got out his iron box to pore over the ancient parchments while he ate his breakfast. He was hunched over them now, and as he read, he fingered his sword. Curly Green motioned to Mingy, and they went out into Gummy's house. He's been to the mountain. I know because there's gray dust on his slippers, she said, beginning to snap roots for a fish chowder. But he doesn't want to worry us until he finds out. Mingy, what do you think made the tapping sounds? Mingy took a handful of roots and began to break them up into the pot. Dunno. Wouldn't guess. What I say is, do what has to be done and keep a sharp eye. And right now, we need a roof. As soon as the fish chowder was simmering over the fire, the 3 set off for the marshy grove of willows west of the knoll. Walter the Earl hesitated between his sword and ash plant, and finally chose to take the sword. Birds sang and dipped and flashed their wings and soared again into the blue sky, and the willows trembled in the breeze. They found a bank carpeted with tiny blue wood flowers. Spring ting-a-ling, spring, Mingy sang in a voice like walnut shells being scraped over a rock. He stopped abruptly and cleared his throat. What nonsense, he growled. Don't know what got into me. But Curly Green picked up the tune, and Mingy found himself adding his cracked notes in spite of himself. Even Walter the Earl came out of his reverie enough to rumble along with them. Bright sunshine, blue flowers, pink rainbows, moisty showers, spring ting-a-ling, spring. They finally began to strip the tender young willow wands from the trees, but even with the knives they had brought with them, they found it a very wearying, difficult task. The wands clung tenaciously to the mother trunks. There ought to be an easier way, Curly Green panted. I've never seen willow more determined not to be made into a roof. Let's try the sword, said Mingy. Walter the Earl looked dubious. I don't know. He felt the blade and then touched it gingerly against a small branch. The twig was instantly severed from the trunk. It's like magic, Curly Green cried. Uncommonly sharp, Minji admitted. Have a care, you'll cut your finger off. But Walter the Earl ran his finger straight along the cutting edge. It doesn't feel sharp. That has been worrying me. Look! He held up his finger. There was only a small indentation where it had pressed against the blade. He laid the sword lightly against another branch, and the twig snapped off with a crack. Then it must be the secret. Curly Green pressed her own finger against the blade, lightly at first, and then harder as nothing happened. You see, it doesn't hurt us, only other things. They stared wonderingly at the weapon until Minji suddenly stirred. Well, let's hurt some willow wands then. I'm going to fetch 2 more of the swords. And he set off on a run back to the knoll. Excited by their discovery of the sword's secret power, the 3 outlaws set the blunt, sharp edges to work amongst the willows. The blades cut keenly through the fresh green shoots, and the pile of wands grew higher and higher. When their stomachs told them it was time for lunch, they bound the wands into bundles and packed them back to the knoll over their shoulders. About enough for 1/4 of the roof, Minji observed over the fish chowder. Uncommonly good chowder, this. What's in it? I haven't the least idea, Curly Green confessed. Some kind of roots that Muggles collected before she went off this morning. She says that all she has to do is look at roots, and if her mouth waters, then they're good to eat. Walter the Earl said little or nothing, but he kept his sword near him and his eyes often in the direction of the Sunset Mountains, just visible through a break in the trees from their knoll. After lunch, they all stretched out for 40 winks, and then it was time to go back to the marsh. They worked through the long, dappled afternoon until even Minji was satisfied that they had cut enough wands to make a good, tight, weatherproof roof for the new stone house. How still it has become, Curly Green said, leaning on her sword, which she had stuck into the earth. I suppose we've frightened the birds away with our noise. But just listen. There isn't a sound anywhere. Minji looked up from where he was tying a bundle of wands and listened. There wasn't the faintest rustle to be heard. An unearthly silence blanketed the marsh. Walter the Earl stirred uneasily and lifted his sword. Then they heard it, although afterward they never could agree as to exactly what they had heard. Minji said it was a fat sort of noise. Walter the Earl claimed that it was an approaching kind of thing, but Curly Green described it as just a sound-like sound. At any rate, it was something. And they stood immobile in the now silent marsh, with the slanting afternoon sun speckling the shade all around them in eerie patterns. As they stared about them through the drooping willows, Walter the Earl felt his hand grow warm. He looked down. Like the blackness of night giving way before the slate gray of dawn, the sword in his hand was changing before his transfixed eyes. And as it changed, it grew less heavy. Look, Walter the Earl said in a husky whisper, but Curly Green and Minji were staring at their own swords. He watched the slate gray become pearl gray, and the haft in his grip felt lighter and lighter. The sound came again through the hanging willow fronds, but he scarcely heard it, his eyes fastened on the blade. It began to glow, then to shimmer, until he could no longer clearly see the edges of the blade, but only a radiance brighter than the sun at noonday. The haft was feather light, and then along the length of the blade, faint marks appeared, burning there with a magic older than Gammage. At the same instant, the sound that was fat or approaching or merely sound-like changed to a whimpering, a squeaking, a weaking. For a moment longer, the faint marks showed, and then they faded, and the shimmering, glimmering radiance began to dim. The weaking grew fainter and fainter as the light dimmed out of the sword. It dulled to pearl gray, then to slate gray, and finally it hung black and heavy in Walter the Earl's hand. In the branches above, a returning bird gave a cautious chirp. Chapter 15. A net across the little trickle won't catch fish in the Watercress River. Muggles' maxims. When Muggles and Gummy came away from the door of Fooley Hall, they walked quickly down the small road going nowhere toward the last house where Reedy and Crambo the basket maker lived. Occasionally, a curtain fluttered in a house they passed, as though somebody had stepped quickly away from the window. but otherwise there wasn't a sound or emotion on the street. "It doesn't look as though we'd get much help, does it?" Muggles suddenly asked. "Help? For what? We don't need any help." "We might," said Muggles, frowning down at the glitterstones on her cloak. Reedy's face was stiff with displeasure when she opened the door to their knock. "Oh, it's you." "Delighted to hear you say it," said Gummy, doffing his hat. "I was beginning to think we weren't us at all." "I suppose you'll have to come in now that you're here." Reedy stood aside ungraciously. Muggles and Gummy entered the cottage. Crambo's handiwork lined the walls and bobbed from the ceiling. Baskets in the shape of fish and in the shape of boats, enormous hampers and receptacles so tiny that only a child's thimble would fit into them. By the window sat Crambo, his deft fingers working pliant strands into yet another basket. "Can't say I'm happy to see you," he said without raising his eyes, "but now that you're here, you may as well sit down." Muggles and Gummy looked around helplessly. There seemed to be nothing to sit on. But Reedy lifted 2 large willow hampers off their hooks on the walls and placed them upside down by the table. "Chairs," she said. "Sit." They all sat down while Reedy went into the next room. Crambo ignored them completely. After trying 2 or 3 times to engage him in conversation and getting nothing but silence in reply, Gummy wrestled paper and wax writer from his pocket and lost himself in his scribbles. Muggles sat watching for a while and then got up determinedly and went into the other room, where Reedy was stowing Muggles' belongings in a large hamper as fast as she could work. "You're very kind," Muggles began. "I agree," Reedy snapped. "Reedy, I know you don't believe in the fire. Then why talk about them?" Muggles felt her temper fraying. "You used to at least listen to both sides of the story." Reedy rammed a clay pot into the hamper and then stood up straight. It's no use you're going on at me, Muggles. I haven't anything against you, but I can't afford to have anything for you. So why don't you go back to your wilds and let us alone?" "Very well," Muggles said. There seemed to be no way to reach Reedy anymore. Suddenly she blurted out, "Reedy, listen. Suppose that we should be in a great danger." Reedy peered at her suspiciously. "What kind of danger?" "Just danger." Reedy stirred uneasily and for the first time looked Muggles directly in the eye. "What could I do about it?" she demanded. Muggles drew a breath. "You could listen, the way you always used to when you weren't afraid of the periods. That's all, just listen. Everybody else seems to have become deaf." Reedy gave her a long, searching look. "I promise nothing," she said at last. "At least..." She went into the other room and returned with a loaf of bread and a pat of butter wrapped in leaves, which she laid on top of the other things in the hamper. "There you are," she said. "You can keep the hamper. It's an old one the wood mice have chewed." And with that, Muggles had to be content. When Crambo discovered that his 2 guests were really leaving, he became almost cordial and walked to the door with them. "I suppose this is the last we'll see of you," he mumbled, "so I'll wish you good luck." "And if..." Reedy said suddenly, and then stopped. "If what?" asked Muggles. "If you see any of the periods, you might explain that you only came here to get your stuff," Reedy finished rapidly. But Muggles was sure that that was not what she had started to say. Muggles and Gummy trudged up the small road going nowhere, the heavy hamper swinging between them. There were 2 or 3 green-cloaked figures visible in the marketplace, but by the time the 2 outlaws reached the cobblestones, the square was empty, and the only sound was a small murmuring from the meeting house, where the children were learning their new lessons. "Almost makes you feel sorry for the lamprey, doesn't it?" said Gummy. "Do you wish you hadn't come, Muggles?" "Yes? No. I don't know. But I'll be glad to get back home." "Huss," said Gummy. "Advance the standard, lower the hoist. We got company ahead." Littid stood uncertainly on the doorstone of the mayor's house, waiting for them. "Greetings." "Greetings," they answered. Littid patted his beard with nervous fingers. I thought I should like a few words with you, if you can spare me a moment." "Certainly," Gummy said, and added in an impudent whisper, "But a flapping tongue 'tis best to bridle. They fine ye here for being idle." Littid flushed from the roots of his beard up to his hair. what I wanted to talk to you about, some hasty words have been spoken and some hasty actions taken, and I can't help feeling that there have been possibly injustices on both sides, mind you, on both sides. Now, what I've been thinking, he's going to do it, Muggles thought in a sudden panic. He's going to ask us to come back. We can come home and everything will be the way it used to be before Curly Green and I ate those peppermints together. And she glanced at Gummy. There was a peculiar sort of smile curving his lips. It seems to me, Litid went on, and his glance dropped to Muggles' orange cloak, then away as though the sight pained him. It seems to me that these misunderstandings can be straightened out. We give in a little, and he chuckled nervously. You give in a little. What I am trying to say, in short, is that you're inviting us to come back to the village? Asked Gummy quietly. Yes. No, well, not inviting, for of course there would have to be arrangements with those who, with those, but I see no reason why this couldn't be done. And the 5 of you could come slipping back into your old places after the judges have gone. Muggles looked at him blankly. After the judges have gone? Yes, of course. Well, I mean, you could hardly come back before, could you? The Gammage Cup and all that. You see, Muggles compressed her lips in sudden anger. Yes, I see. And when we come slipping back, or sneaking back, which is what you really mean, so that you could feel cozy with yourself for forgiving us, you would start feeling ashamed of us all over again. But it wouldn't matter. Once the judges have gone, and I would go on being poor, simple old Muggles, as though I'd never been away. She paused to snatch a breath and hurried on before Litid could raise his astonished mouth from his beard. Well, I'm not poor, simple old Muggles any longer, and I'm never going to be poor, simple old Muggles again. Sometimes I used to write out my name, MGLS period, with a period, just to see how it must feel to be somebody instead of nobody. But I don't have to do that now. On our knoll, nobody cares how I spell my name. It's just me, plain Muggles, that they care about. And I wouldn't put a period after it if you gave me one in a special meeting. So that's how it is, and I know you meant it kindly, but no, thank you. I'm not coming back before or after the judges have gone. Gummy picked up his side of the hamper. I don't believe I have a single thing to add, he said. Let us up and away, my dear Muggles. They left Litid, staring after them in stunned silence. Gummy went on chuckling long after they had left the village and were paddling up the little trickle. The finest sight I'll ever see is Muggles' temper on a spree. Whee! It was well past tea time when they paddled under the willow fronds and made fast the boat at the little dock. Hello up there, Gummy shouted. We're home! But there was no answering call. Gummy made a wry face. We don't seem to inspire welcoming committees today, my dear Muggles. Hi-ho, we'll just have to make the best of it. Muggles took hold of one side of the hamper and he the other, and they swung it onto the dock. You don't suppose they've gone back to the mountain? Muggles asked with an anxious glance up at the grassy slope. More likely they're fast asleep, having eaten our tea as well as theirs, Gummy grumbled. But when they had struggled up the slope to the top of the knoll with the hamper, there was no sign of the others, and no sign of tea. Muggles bustled about, stirring up the fire in Gummy's house, putting on the kettle and mixing batter for pat cakes, while Gummy rattled around like a pebble in a box. Well, when Muggles almost ran him down for the 3rd time in her scurryings, she stopped in exasperation. Whatever are you prowling around about? Swords, said Gummy. I didn't want to alarm you until I was sure, but they've taken 3 of the swords with them. Batter dripped off of Muggles' mixing spoon onto the clean stone floor as she stared at him. You're dripping, Gummy said mechanically. Muggles looked from the spoon to the floor, as though they had nothing to do with her. Are you sure about the swords? Gummy nodded. Of course, they may be using them to cut willow wands. There's a heap of them already cut by the new house, so maybe they're down at the marsh getting more. I think I'll just amble along that way and see. Not without me, said Muggles, and we'll take the other 2 swords with us. She suddenly became aware of the puddle of batter at her feet. Oh my goodness, look at the mess I'm making. Why didn't you tell me? A few moments later, they sallied forth, bearing the 2 remaining swords. A sword was an awkward article to carry, Muggles soon learned. It was too heavy to hold long in one hand and too awkward to carry in both. After trying it all ways, she settled for wielding it like a walking stick and hoped she wouldn't harm the point. They had scarcely reached the bottom of the knoll on the western side when Gummy's keen ears picked up the sound of cautious footsteps through the trees. He stopped short, his outthrust arm warning Muggles to silence. For long moments they stood, scarcely breathing, until Muggles, who had come to rest in the middle of a step with one foot still in the air, thought she couldn't hold that stance a second longer. Then a voice near at hand unfroze them. It was Minji's familiar grumbling tones. "I suppose," he was saying, "it's too much to hope that Muggles is back to make pat cakes for tea." They appeared through the trees, Minji and Curly Green and Walter the Earl, and on their backs were tremendous bundles of willow wands, 3 times as big as they. In their hands they carried swords from which their gaze never wandered as they trudged wearily along. Only then did Muggles realize how frightened she had been. "Of course there are pat cakes for tea," she called in a shaking voice. "We couldn't imagine what had..." But she was talking to thin air. At the first sound of her voice, the 3 had chucked their bundles of willow wands and leaped behind the trees. "It's us!" Gummy shouted. "What is wrong with you?" The 3 emerged from their shelters a little shamefacedly, but their swords were still at the ready. "We'll tell you when we get home," said Walter the Earl. "Give us a hand with these bundles, will you?" It was impossible to talk on the upgrade to the knoll. There wasn't enough breath left among the 5 of them to form one sentence. Arriving at the top, they piled the willow wands beside the new stone house and paused to gasp. Then, "There is something in this valley beside Minipins," Walter the Earl announced quietly. "But how?" demanded Muggles. They were sitting in the open, finishing their tea and keeping close watch on the 5 swords, which were dangling from the roof of the sleeping shelter. Gummy had recounted their adventures in the village, but those happenings seemed distant and unimportant in the face of this new and terrible event that the others told of. "But how?" Muggles persisted. "How did they get into the valley? They couldn't come down the mountain. Nobody could. And besides, everybody knows that the only way into the valley is through the Watercress Tunnel when the river is dried up, which it isn't. They couldn't... It's not balloons, is it?" Walter the Earl shook his head. "I think we heard them yesterday, although we didn't realize at the time what it meant." And suddenly, Muggles could hear in her mind as clearly as though they were back in the abandoned mine, tap, 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 like fingernails drumming on a table, or raindrops splattering on a stone, and Muggles shivered, like pickaxes chipping away at the rock in an old mine. "But why?" she cried. "Gold," said Minji, and the word fell like a chill upon them. "In the ancient scrolls," said Walter the Earl, "I read that gold was one of the great causes of battles. That's what the marauders took away when they swooped down on Minipin villages. Everything made of gold. Perhaps that's why the mines were abandoned. Even in this safe, secure valley, Gammage must have felt that the possession of gold was an evil that brought greater evil upon the villages." But if they, the outsiders, had eaten so far into the mountain, they must have been at it for months, perhaps even years. Muggles looked at the others in dismay. All this time, while life went calmly on in the valley, something had been nibbling away at their peace, working to destroy them even as they tended the watercress beds and fished the streams and sent the mayor to Watersplash and had their holidays and fussed over the colors of doors. "Of course, we don't know that they're enemies," said Gummy. "Maybe the swords light up when friends approach." "You didn't hear the way they whimpered," Curly Green gave a shudder. "They were afraid, horribly afraid, weren't they, Minji?" "Every bit as afraid as me," Minji agreed with emphasis. They fell silent then, each occupied with his own forebodings. Muggles went into Gummy's house to brew more tea, and while she waited for the water to boil, she made herself think of practical things, such as mending the roof that had leaked on Gummy the night of the fires on the mountains and waked him up, else he never would have seen them. And if he hadn't seen them, Muggles thought, she wouldn't have gone pelting back to slipper on the water, and the sound of his slippers on the cobblestones wouldn't have wakened her, and she wouldn't have gone to the museum the long way around and so met Curly Green, and the water suddenly came to a full boil. "And the fin and tail of it," Muggles concluded as she infused the sassafras leaves, "is that now I am here, and I shall see that the roof is mended." She carried the tea outside and poured it into the cups. The sun had disappeared beyond the mountains. The long shadows were dropping over the knoll. At least, Muggles offered, as consolation along with her strong tea, at least we seem to be protected by the swords. Remember how the tapping stopped in the old mine when the swords began to glow? And then this afternoon, the marauders ran away in fright. So, oh yes, said Walter the Earl softly. We seem to be safe enough as long as we have the swords. But what about the rest of the valley? Oh, Curly Green sat up straight. They could get around us, couldn't they? By making a wide circle where the swords couldn't harm them. Walter the Earl nodded. So it rather looks as though it's up to us to do something about it, doesn't this part left? So if you want to come back, find out what's going on, find out who is invading the land between the mountains, you got to come back next week. And I will hopefully see you then. Thank you so much. Bye.